The setting sun burned across the desert horizon like an open furnace, casting long, blood-red shadows over the cracked earth. The dry wind whistled between weathered rocks, carrying the taste of dust and salt. Elias Boone stood in the center of a ring of rifles aimed squarely at him, his fingers loose but his eyes hard as stone. The wide brim of his hat shaded his sweat-soaked face, and his leather coat was already marked with dark stains of heat and tension. Beside him, young Clara Whitford, dressed in a simple brown dress, stared down at the ground, clutching an old empty glass bottle, the same bottle that had changed everything just hours earlier. The men surrounding them said nothing. From somewhere in the distance came the slow, ominous echo of hoofbeats. From the crest of a nearby dune, Zeb Crowfoot appeared astride a coal-black horse, a red bandana covering half his face. Behind him, Silas Snakebite Vane and 4 other men fanned out, their weapons ready, moving like vultures circling a carcass. Elias knew this wasn't a warning, it was a sentencing. The heat shimmered in the air, warping their silhouettes, but the tension was as real and solid as a prison wall. His hand hovered near the grip of his revolver, but he didn't move. Clara stepped back, her foot catching on the uneven ground. Zeb's eyes locked on her for a moment before returning to Elias. "This ain't about the cattle, Boone," his voice was deep, slicing through the silence like a blade. Sweat slid down Elias's temple. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of leather and gunpowder. If he drew now, there would be no time to think, and even with luck on his side, Clara wouldn't survive the crossfire. Silas stepped forward, spitting into the dirt before speaking. "You should have stayed away from that waterhole, Boone. Folks out here don't forget who breaks the desert's rules." Elias held his gaze. The rules of the desert, those words burned hotter than the sun. Because he knew it wasn't the water they wanted. It was something he carried, something Clara had no idea even existed. The wind rose, kicking up spirals of grit between them. Zeb's finger slowly touched the trigger, like a man savoring the moment before a kill. Elias drew a deep breath and glanced at Clara. Her wide eyes were filled with fear, but somewhere in them was trust. She didn't yet understand what was about to happen, but he did. He felt each second stretch longer, as though time itself was forcing him to make a choice. And that's when he realized, they hadn't come for the cattle. They hadn't come for the water. They'd come for him. The day before the standoff, the desert felt almost forgiving. The early morning light stretched across the horizon in soft gold, and a faint breeze carried the scent of mesquite. Elias Boone stood by the corral, tightening the cinch on his mare, Daisy, while the faint creak of wood came from the barn behind him. The ranch had been quiet for weeks, and he preferred it that way. Trouble in the desert had a way of finding you when you weren't looking, and Elias was a man who had learned to keep his head down. He tipped his hat against the rising sun and glanced toward the distant ridges, where the heat shimmer was already starting to blur the view. Clara Whitford appeared from the barn, carrying a dented tin pail nearly half her size. She wasn't family by blood, but ever since her parents had passed, Elias had taken her in. She was quiet, observant, but had a stubborn streak that could match his. "We're low on water," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. Elias nodded, glancing toward the windmill pump, which had been groaning louder than usual. Out here, a failing pump wasn't just a chore, it was a warning sign. After a quick breakfast of biscuits and black coffee, Elias saddled up and rode into town. The dirt main street of Dry Creek was coming alive, the hammering of the blacksmith's anvil, the clink of bottles from the saloon, the creak of wagon wheels. He tipped his hat at Maeve Carter, who was sweeping the front steps of her boarding house, and stopped briefly outside the general store to trade a few words with Reverend Josiah Harper. It was all routine until he noticed a rider he didn't recognize watering his horse by the trough outside the sheriff's office. The man had a face like carved stone and eyes that never stopped scanning the street. Elias didn't like the way the stranger's gaze lingered on him before drifting toward Clara, who had insisted on riding into town with him. The stranger didn't speak, but the curve of his mouth held the faintest suggestion of a smirk. Elias led Daisy past, pretending not to notice, but his gut told him something was off. Inside the store, he overheard Sheriff Amos Greeley speaking in a low voice to Silas Snakebite Vane. The name alone made Elias pause. Silas was a man whose deals never ended clean. Words like shipment and water rights floated through the open door. Elias stepped back before he could be seen, his mind taking over. In the desert, water wasn't just life, it was power. By the time they rode back to the ranch, the sun was high and the air heavy with heat. Clara rode ahead, humming softly, but Elias kept glancing over his shoulder at the empty trail behind them. He didn't see the stranger again, but the image of that smirk clung to him like dust on his boots. Something had shifted, and though he couldn't name it yet, he knew it had already begun. By dawn the next morning, Elias Boone was already outside, patching a broken fence rail near the eastern pasture. The air was cool, but the sun's promise of heat was crawling up over the horizon. He worked in silence, listening to the low groan of the windmill pump in the distance, when he heard the clatter of hooves on hard ground. Clara came running from the house, her face pale. "There's someone at the well," she said, breathless. Elias dropped his tools and strode toward the pump. Sure enough, the stranger from town stood there, filling a canteen. His horse was slick with sweat, as though it had been ridden hard through the night. Elias stopped a few yards away, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "You're a long way from anywhere, friend," he said. The man looked up, unfazed, and tipped his hat. "Name's Abel Crowder. I was told this was the only water for miles." His voice was even, but his eyes held a weight Elias didn't trust. Clara stood just behind Elias, clutching the hem of her dress. Abel glanced at her briefly before focusing back on Elias. "I've got no quarrel with you, Boone," he said, "but there's trouble moving this way. Men who don't care much about whose land they cross or whose water they take." Elias studied him for a moment, feeling the push and pull of instinct. The smart thing was to send him away. Strangers with vague warnings tended to leave storms in their wake. Later, over coffee at the kitchen table, Elias told Clara he was thinking of riding out to warn the neighboring ranchers. Clara frowned. "If he's telling the truth, we should help him," she said. Elias gave her a long look. Helping him might mean bringing that trouble right to our doorstep. He knew how the desert worked: choose the wrong side, and you didn't get a second chance. By midday, Elias had ridden into Dry Creek to speak with Sheriff Greeley. The sheriff listened, chewing slowly on a piece of jerky, then shook his head. "Best keep your head down, Boone. If Crowfoot's boys are moving through, it ain't our fight. Folks who stick their noses in other men's business usually end up in Boot Hill." The words were meant as advice, but they sat heavy in Elias's gut. That night, long after Clara had gone to bed, Elias stood on the porch staring at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, men were riding, maybe toward him, maybe not. But if Abel was right, ignoring it could mean disaster for more than just his land. The desert didn't wait for you to make up your mind. And Elias knew, by sunrise, he'd have to choose. The first sign came with the dust. Elias Boone spotted it mid-morning, a faint brown smear on the horizon to the north. It was too thick and too steady to be wind alone. He set down the feed sack he'd been carrying and squinted against the glare. Clara, hanging laundry nearby, followed his gaze. "Riders?" she asked softly. Elias didn't answer right away. Out here, dust like that usually meant someone was coming, and they weren't in a hurry to leave. By midday, the wind shifted and carried the faint sound of hoofbeats. Elias saddled Daisy and rode to the ridge east of the ranch, keeping low behind the rocks. Through the shimmer of heat, he saw them, 5 men on horseback, moving slow but deliberate. Even at a distance, their silhouettes carried a certain menace: broad hats pulled low, rifles slung easy, like they were in no rush because they already owned the ground they rode on. He recognized one of them by the sway in his shoulders: Silas Snakebite Vane. When Elias returned to the ranch, Clara was waiting by the porch, her hands twisted in her apron. "Is it them?" she asked. He nodded once. "We've got time, but not much." He glanced toward the barn, where Abel Crowder was sitting in the shade, sharpening a knife. "Your friends are moving closer," Elias called out. Abel didn't look up. "They ain't my friends," he said. "And if they're coming this way, it's not just for water." Elias rode into Dry Creek that afternoon, hoping to find out more before the trouble reached his land. The town felt different, tense. At the saloon, hushed voices carried whispers of coded messages passed through the telegraph office and a deal gone bad over land rights near the river. Maeve Carter caught him at the door and murmured, "I heard Crowfoot's men are looking for something, or someone." Best be ready." Her eyes darted toward the street as if expecting to see them any moment. By the time he got back, the sun was low and the sky had turned a deep, burning orange. From the ridge, Elias could now see the riders' campfires flickering in the distance. The smell of smoke drifted faintly on the air. Clara came to stand beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're closer than I thought." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Closer than anyone thought." That night, the ranch was silent but for the creak of the windmill and the low, restless snort of the horses in the corral. Elias didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, eyes on the dark horizon. The desert had gone still, and that stillness carried a weight he knew too well. Trouble wasn't coming tomorrow, it was already here. The next morning broke sharp and cold, the kind of chill that didn't belong in the desert and made the air feel thin. Elias Boone had been up since before dawn, saddling Daisy and checking his rifle. He figured if the trouble was coming, it was better to meet it on the trail than wait for it to land on his porch. Clara protested, but he told her to stay put, keep the doors barred, and not open for anyone but him. The look in her eyes told him she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Halfway to Dry Creek, the land narrowed into a dry wash flanked by jagged rock walls. That's where he saw them, 2 riders blocking the trail. Silas Snakebite Vane sat easy in the saddle, reins loose in one hand, the other resting on a revolver. Beside him was Harlan Dustjaw McCree, his face hidden behind a faded kerchief. They didn't call out. They didn't have to. The message was clear, he wasn't going any farther without answering to them. Elias slowed Daisy to a stop, letting the silence stretch. "You boys out for a morning ride, or is this a business call?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying. Silas's smile was thin and cold. "We heard you've been keeping company with a man named Abel Crowder. Now, Crowfoot don't take kindly to strangers sniffing around his affairs." Harlan's eyes never left Elias, his fingers drumming lightly on the saddle horn. "I don't recall owing Crowfoot anything," Elias said. "And I sure don't recall inviting him onto my land." The words were steady, but inside, Elias knew this was the point where things could turn fast. Silas's grin widened. "You're on his land now, Boone. You just don't see the fence posts yet." His tone carried the kind of quiet threat that wasn't meant to be misunderstood. Before either side could draw, the sharp crack of a rifle split the air from somewhere above the wash. A bullet kicked dust near Harlan's boot, sending both men's horses sidestepping. Silas wheeled his mount around, scanning the ridge, but the shooter was gone before they could spot him. Elias took the moment to spur Daisy forward, slipping past before they regrouped. It wasn't a victory, but it was breathing room, and in the desert, that counted for a lot. As he put distance between himself and the wash, Elias knew the reprieve wouldn't last. Someone out there had just shifted the balance, and whether they meant to help or hurt him remained to be seen. The one thing he was certain of, this wasn't going to end with a polite handshake. It was only a matter of time before he'd have to stand toe-to-toe with Crowfoot himself. Elias Boone reached Dry Creek under a sky the color of hammered steel, the morning sun smothered by a haze of dust. The town was quieter than usual, doors half closed, conversations cut short when he passed. He tied Daisy outside Maeve Carter's boarding house and went inside, hoping to find Abel Crowder. Maeve met him in the hallway, her face tight. "He's upstairs," she whispered. "And you'd better hear what he has to say before you decide which side you're on." Abel sat by the window of a small rented room, cleaning a battered revolver. His eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness, but they sharpened when Elias stepped inside. "I didn't tell you everything," Abel began, his voice low. "Crowfoot's not after me because of some water dispute. He's after what I've got proof he's been running guns through the reservations and blaming the tribes for the raids." The words landed heavy, the kind of accusation that could start a war. Elias paced the room, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "If that's true, you've got every lawman from here to the border after you, along with Crowfoot's entire gang." Abel nodded grimly. "The law can't touch him without hard evidence. That's where you come in. You've got land he can't intimidate you off of, not yet. I need a place to hide this." He tapped the worn leather satchel on the table. "Inside's enough to bury him if it gets into the right hands." Elias turned toward the window, looking down at the dusty street. Below, two of Crowfoot's men were leaning against a hitching post, pretending to swap jokes while keeping their eyes on the boarding house. "You realize," Elias said, "if I help you, they'll burn my ranch to the ground." Abel's reply was steady. "If you don't, they'll take it anyway, and everything else you care about." Men like Crowfoot don't stop. A knock came at the door, 3 sharp raps. Maeve slipped inside, her voice tense. "Sheriff Greeley's here. He says he needs to talk, now." Abel's jaw tightened. "Greeley's in Crowfoot's pocket. If he knows I'm here, we're out of time." Elias's mind raced, weighing the risk of handing Abel over versus the storm that would follow if he stood with him. He made the choice in silence, taking the satchel and tucking it under his coat. "We leave now, through the back," he said. Abel's eyes flashed with surprise, then gratitude. As they slipped out into the narrow alley, Elias knew the moment was set in stone, there was no going back. Whatever came next, it would put his life, his land, and Clara right in the path of a war. They rode hard out of Dry Creek, keeping to the narrow washes and arroyos that cut like scars through the desert. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain from far-off mountains, but Elias Boone knew they wouldn't have the cover of weather for long. Clara was waiting at the ranch, unaware that the satchel under his coat was worth more than gold and dangerous enough to get them all killed. Abel Crowder rode beside him, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges. By the time they reached the ranch, the afternoon sun was slipping low, throwing long shadows across the yard. Clara ran out from the porch, relief on her face, but it faded when she saw Abel. "Why's he here?" she asked, her voice tense. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he told her to pack a small bag and be ready to leave at a moment's notice. "We're not running," Clara shot back, stubborn as ever. Elias gave her a hard look. "Not running, moving to higher ground." She didn't argue after that. As dusk fell, Elias led them to the old line shack up in the foothills, a place hidden by cottonwoods and forgotten by most. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cedar, and the only light came from a narrow window slit. Abel spread a crude map on the table, tracing the path to a telegraph station 2 days' ride north. "If we can get the evidence to a U.S. Marshal, Crowfoot's finished," he said. Elias stared at the map, knowing the route was dangerous, narrow passes, no water for miles, and Crowfoot's men likely waiting along every trail. That night, Elias took the first watch outside, rifle across his lap. The desert stretched silent under a canopy of stars, but he couldn't shake the feeling they were already surrounded. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and the horses shifted uneasily in the corral. Abel stepped out quietly. "If you want to walk away, Boone, now's your chance," he murmured. Elias shook his head. "Walk away, and they'll come for me anyway. This is my fight now." Just before dawn, Elias heard it, the faint, rhythmic thud of hooves, too many to be stray riders. He woke Clara and Abel, his voice low but urgent. "They've found us." Through the window slit, the first shadows appeared, moving like ghosts through the cottonwoods. A dozen riders, at least, fanning out to surround the shack. Elias tightened the strap on his revolver and took a breath. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the odds were worse than he'd ever faced. But deep inside, a plan was already taking shape, dangerous, desperate, and maybe the only way out. Whatever happened next, it would be decided in minutes, and there'd be no second chances. The riders emerged from the cottonwoods like shadows given form, their horses snorting clouds into the cold dawn air. Elias Boone counted at least 12 men, and at their center sat Zeb Crowfoot, a red bandana tied loose around his neck, the morning light glinting off the silver conchos on his saddle. His gaze locked on the shack, calm and unhurried, like a man who already believed he'd won. Behind him, Silas Snakebite Vane grinned, tapping the stock of his rifle against his thigh. Inside, Clara clutched the empty glass bottle from days before, her knuckles white. Abel Crowder leaned over the table, whispering to Elias, "We can't hold out long, they'll burn us out before they rush." Elias studied the satchel, the proof against Crowfoot. The only way to end this was to put it in front of someone with enough authority to use it and survive long enough to tell the story. He glanced at Clara, then at Abel. "We're going to talk first," he said. Elias stepped out, his rifle lowered but ready. The air was tense, the silence heavy enough to choke on. "Crowfoot," he called. "You're not here for the water or the land. You're here for what Crowder's carrying." Zeb's smile was slow, deliberate. "Then you already know what happens if I don't get it." His voice was smooth, almost friendly, but the edge beneath it could cut glass. Elias took a step forward, holding the satchel high enough for all to see. "You want it, you'll have to take it in front of witnesses who'll ride straight to the marshal's office." Murmurs ran through Crowfoot's men, and a few glanced uneasily at each other. Zeb's eyes narrowed. Before he could speak, another voice rang out from the tree-line. "Or maybe you won't be taking anything today." From the shadows rode Sheriff Amos Greeley, unexpected, his badge glinting, a half-dozen armed townsfolk behind him. Elias's eyes narrowed, he'd been sure Greeley was in Crowfoot's pocket. Zeb turned in the saddle, visibly caught off guard. "You picking sides now, Sheriff?" Greeley's face was hard. "I'm picking the law, Crowfoot. And I just heard enough to hang you twice over." For a moment, it seemed the gunfight would explode then and there, but Zeb's men hesitated, the tide of confidence breaking. Elias could feel it in the air, a shift, subtle but real. Crowfoot's grip on his gang wasn't as unshakable as it looked. Still, no one lowered their weapons. Everything balanced on the razor's edge, waiting for the next move that would decide who walked away and who didn't. The silence between the two groups stretched like a taut rope, every man's finger itching near the trigger. Elias Boone stood in the open, the satchel dangling from his hand, the weight of the proof inside heavier than lead. Sheriff Greeley's voice broke the tension first. "Crowfoot, you can ride out now, or you can test how fast 12 rifles can spit lead." The sheriff's men leveled their guns, their faces grim and set. Zebediah Crowfoot let out a slow chuckle, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. He glanced at Silas Snakebite Vane, whose usual grin had vanished. One by one, Crowfoot's riders shifted in their saddles, doubt creeping in. Elias could see it, the fracture in their loyalty. Crowfoot's empire wasn't built on friendship, it was built on fear. And fear was a fragile foundation when the odds began to tilt. "You think some scraps of paper will bring me down, Boone?" Crowfoot called out, his tone sharper now. Elias lifted the satchel higher. "Not just papered ledgers, maps, names. Every shipment, every payoff. Enough to make you a permanent guest of the territorial prison." The murmurs among Crowfoot's men grew louder, a few pulling back their horses. Crowfoot's jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, Elias thought the outlaw might draw anyway, gambling everything in one last blaze of gunfire. But then Silas spoke, his voice flat. "This ain't worth dying for, Zeb." That single sentence cracked the tension wide open. Two of Crowfoot's riders turned their mounts away, then a third. The balance had shifted completely. With a hiss of frustration, Crowfoot yanked his reins, spinning his horse toward the trees. "This isn't over," he spat, but the words felt more like a retreat than a promise. One by one, the rest followed, until only the dust of their departure hung in the morning air. Sheriff Greeley signaled his men to lower their rifles, but his eyes stayed on the trail long after they'd gone. Elias handed the satchel to Greeley, locking eyes with him. "Get it to the marshal. Make sure it sticks." The sheriff nodded. Around them, the townsfolk exhaled, the tension draining like water from a cracked barrel. Clara stepped out from the shack, her small frame stiff with pride. "So, we won?" she asked. Elias gave her a tired smile. "We bought peace for now. Out here, that's as close as winning gets." The words hung in the cool air, honest and heavy with the truth of the West. Weeks passed, and the desert began to feel different, not softer, but quieter. The threat that had hung over Dry Creek like a vulture's shadow was gone, though everyone knew it could return on any horizon. Elias Boone kept to his work, mending fences and tending the horses, while Clara Whitford found herself laughing more often, her eyes no longer darting toward every sound in the distance. The ranch felt alive again, though scars, both seen and unseen, lingered like ghost tracks in the sand. One crisp morning, a lone rider appeared at the edge of the property. Elias, hand instinctively near his revolver, relaxed when he recognized Sheriff Greeley. The lawman dismounted slowly, handing Elias a folded piece of paper sealed with the marshal's stamp.
"Crowfoot's in irons," Greeley said simply. The evidence stuck.
He'll be standing in front of a judge before winter.
For the first time in weeks, Elias allowed himself a deep breath. Clara, watching from the porch, broke into a grin.
That evening, the three of them shared a quiet supper in the lamplight. Abel Crowder had vanished shortly after the showdown, leaving only a brief note: "Thank you for standing your ground.
Some debts can't be repaid in gold." Elias didn't know if he'd ever see Abel again, but he suspected the man would survive. Men like him always found a way.
Clara kept the note folded neatly inside the glass bottle she'd carried that fateful day, a reminder of how small choices could change the course of everything. As autumn crept in, Dry Creek held its annual gathering in the town square, a tradition older than most of its buildings. Lanterns swayed on ropes strung between posts, music floated from a battered fiddle, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air.
Clara tugged on Elias's sleeve, urging him toward the crowd.
For a moment, he resisted. He'd never been much for celebrations, but he let her lead him. He saw faces that had once been tight with suspicion now offering nods and handshakes. Later that night, as the music faded and the lanterns burned low, Elias and Clara walked the dusty street back toward the ranch. The stars stretched endless above them, bright against the velvet dark.
"Do you think it's really over?" Clara asked quietly.
Elias glanced down at her, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile.
"Out here, nothing's ever truly over. But some battles don't need fighting twice."
At the porch steps, Elias paused, looking out across the silent desert. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low, "the fastest draw didn't save a life, it was the hand that reached out first." Clara slipped her small hand into his, and together they stepped inside, leaving the night to hold their words.